that takes place in the ovary. Firstly, we have the follicle, just like I've just shown you. The follicle will develop into primary follicle, secondary follicle, tertiary follicle, or Graafian follicle. And that Graafian follicle will secrete more estrogen, and more estrogen or increase in estrogen will cause a decrease in the amount of FSH and stimulate the secretion of LH. And the LH will cause this Graafian follicle to rupture. And the process is called ovulation. The egg will be released. And after the egg is released, what is going to happen with the remain of the ruptured follicle? The LH will convert this remain of the Graafian follicle into the corpus luteum, which will grow and develop and become bigger and bigger. During that time, when the follicle develops, look at the graph. It shows us how the estrogen, when the follicle develops and becomes bigger, the amount of estrogen secreted by the very same follicle also increases up until it reaches a certain stage where the follicle is now bigger and the FSH is now decreased. The LH is produced, and that LH will cause the rupturing of the Graafian follicle. And immediately when the follicle becomes ruptured, what is going to happen with the amount of estrogen is going to decrease immediately after day 14. The amount of estrogen decreases, and the ruptured follicle is converted into corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum will secrete what? Progesterone, and the amount of progesterone will then now increase. As the amount of estrogen decreases because of the ruptured follicle, the amount of progesterone increases because of the development of the corpus luteum. But when the egg is not fertilized, what is going to happen with the amount of estrogen? The amount of progesterone. The amount of progesterone will decrease and become smaller and smaller. After day 14, now the amount of progesterone is back to normal, and what is going to happen with the uterus? The thickness of the endometrium is going, or rather the endometrium lining is going to tear off, and when it tears off, what is going to happen? Menstruation. Right? Where you are asked to describe the menstrual cycle and how it is influenced by different hormones. We are talking about how many hormones? The 4 hormones that I've just explained now. The FSH and the LH secreted by the pituitary gland, and the estrogen and the progesterone secreted by the Graafian follicle, as well as the corpus luteum in the uterus. Right, when you start looking at this question, the first part of this question is to describe the menstrual cycle and how it is influenced by the different hormones. You describe the menstrual cycle. I said the menstrual cycle is a process that is made up of 2 cycles, the ovarian cycle as well as the uterine cycle. You explain the 2 cycles as well as the hormones that are involved. Menstrual cycle is the series of events or changes that occurs in the female's body to prepare it for possible implantation or pregnancy, which involves the 2 cycles, like I've said, the ovarian cycle and as well as the uterine cycle. It takes the average of 28 days. The pituitary gland or the hypophysis first secrete the hormone FSH, and the FSH will now stimulate the what? The development of the primary follicle in the ovary. The developing follicle or the Graafian follicle will secrete the hormone estrogen. The 4 hormones Like I've said, the first one is the pituitary gland, which is the FSH, which is secreted by the pituitary gland. How does it play a role in the menstrual cycle? It stimulates the development of the primary follicle into secondary, tertiary, and Graafian follicle, right? And the Graafian follicle will secrete another hormone, the second hormone, which is the estrogen. And the estrogen will see, what part does the estrogen play in the menstrual cycle? It stimulates the thickening of the lining of the endometrium. It causes the endometrium to be thicker so that it can withstand, or it can be able to carry the fertilized ovum, right? Around day 13 or 14, the pituitary gland or the hypophysis will secrete FSH. There will be a decrease in the amount of FSH, and therefore an increase in the amount of LH. What does the LH, which is the third hormone, what role does the LH play in the menstrual cycle? It causes, firstly, it causes ovulation, the rupturing of the Graafian follicle and the release of the ovum. The remains of the Graafian follicle will now develop into the corpus luteum because of the LH. And this corpus luteum will secrete the fourth hormone, which is the last hormone, the progesterone. What role does progesterone play in the menstrual cycle? The progesterone will continue to stimulate the thickening of the endometrium, or it will maintain the thickness of the endometrium lining or the uterus. And the high level of progesterone, as the corpus luteum develops bigger and bigger, there will be a high level of progesterone. And this high level of progesterone will inhibit or it will inhibit the production of the FSH by the pituitary gland, so that the ovaries are no longer stimulated to produce another follicle. If fertilization does not occur, the corpus luteum will degenerate. And then when it degenerates, it stops producing progesterone. The amount of progesterone will decrease and become smaller and smaller up until it is very, very small to maintain the thickness of the endometrium. The pituitary gland will then secrete, is no longer inhibited to secrete the FSH, and then it will secrete the FSH, and that FSH will now stimulate the development of another follicle immediately after the degeneration of the corpus luteum and the decrease in the amount of the progesterone. The thick endometrium is no longer maintained, or it degenerates, and it is shed together with blood, and that process is menstruation, and it takes place 28 days. It's an essay. Remember, menstrual cycle can also be an essay. You can come across an essay that asks you to explain the menstrual cycle, and the other part, or the other essay that you can be asked in the menstrual cycle. It can be this one. Name the hormones produced by the testes and the ovaries, and describe the role of each hormone in the human reproduction. The hormone secreted by the ovary is the most important one, because we are talking about the ovarian cycle. The one that is secreted by the testes is part of the human reproduction, but it's not part of what we are discussing today, but we can just say something about it. Name the hormones produced by the testes. What are the hormones produced by the testes? There are two hormones. One hormone, that is testosterone. And the hormones secreted by ovaries, there are two: estrogen and progesterone. By just naming those three hormones, you've got 3 marks. 3 marks for naming the 3 hormones, but now you need to also describe the role of each of these 3 hormones in the human reproduction. The estrogen stimulates the thickness of the endometrium, and the progesterone will maintain that thickness of the endometrium, or the lining of the endometrium.